Which models of cross-border governance? The Aachen Treaty, well, we've talked a lot about this. There are two aspects: the commitment of states to provide local, regional, cross-border actors more room for maneuver in terms of competences, of experimentation, and creation of a committee of cooperation cross-border, associating local actors and states as well as national parliamentarians in order to define priority strategies. A draft European regulation to transpose to all border regions, but a few states are rejecting this project, and a discussion has started on the revision of the Schengen Code, which provides for cross-border regions that would need particular attention, border controls, and we saw that this was a plausible hypothesis recently. So how to organize a model of cross-border governance, a place of meeting in terms of legal, administrative framework. Well, we are going to discuss all this today with Sandro Gozi. Good morning. You're a member of the European Parliament, but elected in France and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Italian. So you are yourself a cross-border human being by definition. And with we have also Philippe Voiry with us. Good morning. Please use the microphones that you have on your table to make sure that they are working. Philippe Voiry, Ambassador for Intergovernmental Commissions, Cross-Border Issues and Cooperation. Good morning. Yes, the microphone is working. Thank you very much. Good morning to you. Excellent. And Behmenburg, head of division for cross-border cooperation within the Federal Foreign Office in Germany. So we might well kick off this discussion by explaining that, of course, there is the Aachen Treaty, but not only the Aachen Treaty, and we talked about this during the previous round table, but also between France and Italy, there is the Quirinal Treaty. And so I would like to know why is there a chapter in this treaty on cross-border cooperation? What will it bring concretely, in your opinion, Sandro Gozi? Well, first of all, I would say I think it's a very important treaty for France with a precedent, the Treaty of Aachen, the only precedent, and for Italy, it's a true precedent, because since the existence of the Italian Republic for the first time, Italy also is committing to bilateral cooperation with a neighboring country in the European context. So I think that this is a very significant new treaty. We're ratifying it in Italy. It has to be ratified in France. But from a political point of view, I would say that it already exists. It is also important because I'm convinced that when we talk about local communities, regional communities, border communities, European integration has happened due to special relations and agreements between neighboring countries. And this is something that is close to my heart because I was minister when Emmanuel Macron with Gentiloni. So there was a meeting of heads of state, and on both sides of the Alps, Minister of Foreign Affairs, we had a meeting. And due to the nationalist wave in Italy, it's become a reality. And the idea is to try and organize at all levels an interregional cooperation that goes beyond what might be expected. We might think in France of the Italian border, and I hope that you're probably hoping, I expect you're thinking about the Lyon-Turin tunnel and the migration. And the two go well together, I have to say. The tunnel, the Lyon-Turin tunnel, is real. I've been through it, so it is a reality, and it will be increasingly in 2030 when it's finished. And migration, well, we've shown that by cooperating, we can manage this much better. So does regional cooperation need to stop there? No, of course not. The idea is to develop new forms of cross-border and interregional cooperation in public services, the health services in particular, if we take into account what happened during the COVID pandemic, in the field of energy, education, and other areas. That's the idea with a committee. Of course, we have two experts of the Treaty of Aachen, where representatives at all states, state, regional, and local, could well develop new forms of cross-border cooperation. And I think that this is a very significant move forward, whose potential is enormous. But of course, we need to make full use of this, but I have no doubt that this is where we're heading. Well, that's excellent because you allow me a perfect transition that enables me to ask the question to Philippe Voiry. Uh, During the COVID crisis, when coordination between countries wasn't always at its best. Um, so this, do you think that the model, these Franco-German agreements following the Aachen Treaty, should be replicated? Well, I would say that, yes, it was very useful because it enabled us since the very beginning of the health crisis and the impact on borders. It meant that we could coordinate at technical level and then political level. And this committee capitalized on the experience of the Rhine department, met virtually online on the 12th of March 2020 for the first time. So that's at a time when Germany had not yet closed its borders. And it met at that point every single day. We discussed border issues and the evacuation of patients. And so the Aachen Treaty, the direct implication here, and then of course the meetings happened and following that March meeting. And from September 2020, we started having weekly meetings, and Mr. Behmenburg, in fact, took part. He took part since the very beginning, including those weekly meetings from Berlin with our prefect in Strasbourg. So it was totally unprecedented fact. We had a prefect who, on a weekly basis, talked to Berlin, to the Minister of Health in Berlin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Berlin. And it is going on. Yes, it is going
Et donc, c'est le type
on
de structure
topics of common interest. So it is a very innovative type of structure that we hope to develop with Italy as well, between France and Italy, which we're working on the basis of this treaty that we are speaking of, which will replicate this, what's happening between France and Germany. So you said that you attended the same meetings on both sides of the border. France took the initiative of the Aachen Treaty. Why was it important for Germany? What is the added value of this treaty, in particular regarding the border areas? Well, if I may, I'm going to speak in German so that I can be a little more.
Well, when we started the initiative to renew this contract, it was for Germany, and I think also for our cross-border cooperation. It was an important moment that gave us new opportunities. Friendly, good cooperation started to develop. We don't get an additional value if we just stay at the level that we are at, even if it's a good level already. So this initiative of the Aix-la-Chapelle contract, to renew it served a reinforcement of this contract, but we also wanted to go beyond and make our cooperation more concrete. Philippe Voiry already mentioned this. When we look at the French and German side of the border, and the public structure is very different. So Germany is a federal state, France is a centralized state. So the actors are very different. They work on different topics. So it's important to bring all actors together and to have informal meetings during the crisis, but also formal meetings in the Committee for Cross-Border Cooperation. And not only the national levels, but also the regional levels, the parliament, Eurodistrict, everybody has to be involved and sit down at one table. That helps, especially when you have very different structures in the different countries.
Alors, s'asseoir autour d'une table, Sandro Gozi, c'est aussi le cas de ce qui se passe.
So that's also what happens at the EU. You have European members of parliament who are proposing to generalize the Aachen Treaty across all borders to solve obstacles systemically and over a long term. And I think that's an additional point that's very interesting. To solve these obstacles, some states have blocked it at the council. Is it a misplacement of sovereignty? We can see that there is a temptation to restore borders as soon as you have a problem. What's going to happen now? First of all, I would like to remember what we are speaking about. We are talking about 40% of the territory of the European is trans-border. We're talking about a third of the population lives in a cross-border region. So we're talking about something that's very important, not something marginal, not something secondary that we can kick along the road and forget about. You've spoken about the story of this proposal. This was called the cross-border cooperation mechanism, which is a toolbox to make cooperation on both sides of the border easier. This toolbox was to eliminate legal and administrative obstacles, which often, because of the differences in legislation on either side of the border, prevent local communities from developing projects of a common interest. So something very useful, something very concrete, which is also based on the experience of the Commission, who put in place a tool to solve or to offer solutions to regions to overcome such obstacles. Yes, it is without a doubt miscomprehension of sovereignty for some states, and a presumption where some states might not need that. The two ideas are wrong. The first is wrong because in no way can sovereignty go against the European ideals, because it's voluntary. So each state decides if they want to use it or not. So no state has a border in Europe, in fact. No, for me, no. It's just the British who consider that they didn't really have a border because they are in the sea. The British, the Isles, have maritime borders, but they are borders. But they're no longer in the European Union. No, but the Irish, the Maltese, yes, we'll help them. But we're talking about eliminating legal and administrative obstacles. How does that happen? It's a voluntary mechanism. Each state decides if they want to use it or not. If they want to use it, we can refer to legislation in the other country if the legislation of another country prevents a regional cooperation initiative. So I think that this is something which is very useful. It is something which is doubtless to which the Commission could contribute to local development if projects which could be envisaged or to be envisaged could be made a reality and are not because of administrative obstacles. At the Council, it was stopped. We've worked a lot. We've asked a lot of questions. We've worked with the Commission. We've worked a lot and very well with the French presidency of the European Council to try to make progress. And our wish, our hope, and our commitment formally from the Commission is to present a new revised proposal which takes into account both the position of European parliamentarians, but also the objections of the Council in July. We will see if it will happen. We are pushing a lot because we think we have a need for this, and we have seen even in the presentation before this panel or the previous panels, you have often mentioned the obstacles during the COVID crisis. It is clear that mechanisms can also draw a framework for cooperation in an emergency, be that a health emergency, a migration emergency. We cannot stop cooperation between regions which are hit in the same way by a natural disaster because there is a border within the European Union. So I think we need to push to give new life to this matter before the end of the current mandate to push this forward. And that is also the desire of the French presidency and France. You are right. Treaties offer solutions in some emergency situations, but we don't necessarily have them all. We haven't envisaged them all because recent years have shown unknown emergency situations, ones we could not have envisaged. So Philippe Voiry, revising the Schengen Code, that was a first question which has been addressed by Sandro Gozi, but there's also the revision of the Schengen Code, which think that cross-border regions should respect the management of borders. Are you optimistic about this revision, or are you optimistic about the fact that France's presidency will come to an end, as you know, on the 30th of June? Could France have made more progress on this matter? First of all, I would like to thank the Minister for his convincing advocacy on the cooperation instrument for cross-border cooperation, which was first of all suggested by Luxembourg in 2015 and then converted into a legislative proposal by the European Commission. We really need it. Who is blocking this? Which countries? Name and shame them. No, there are countries which are worried about what it could represent as an attack on sovereignty, whereas in fact that's not the case because it's a voluntary case. And other countries say we don't need this because we already have tools which work. And what's funny is that it is countries who put these tools in place. They put very interesting tools in place. Some of them were mentioned yesterday. And our message to these countries is what you're doing is wonderful, not Luxembourg. So help us to make this available to everybody who would like to use it across the European Union because it's working for you. So don't keep it for yourselves. So moving on, for the Schengen Code, this is one thing that has seen progress during the French presidency with an agreement for the Council, which is a text which is balanced, I think, which must enable, during pandemic situations, broader regions to be handled in specific areas to enable essential journeys. And these border journeys, member states have the opportunity to define them. First of all, we haven't completed this legislation because the text will now be considered by Parliament, and the Parliament's approach is in favour of cross-border cooperation, as the Minister has shown, and we could expect this text to be enriched through the legislative procedure. But we are where we want to be, and we have got a good balance between following our experience of the pandemic. So, Mr. Behmenburg, Germany, does Germany support this project, or what will it change compared to current situation?
Yes. Well, there are also different points in the discussion with regarding to the cross-border cooperation. Mr. President of the MOT has already mentioned it yesterday during his speech, and he mentioned that border regions shouldn't be forgotten. This is enormously important, and I believe that we've got a very, very important task here, and we have a plate role just to strengthen the cross-border regions, and they have become stronger in the recent regions. And we had a very difficult situation at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and since then some special rules have been put into place. And when we discuss about the Schengen Agreement, all these important points are also being taken into account in contrast to before. And also in Germany, I can only talk about the German interior politics in our coalitions agreement between the parties in the national government. We've got an agreement in the current legislative period on the cooperation in cross-border regions. So even if the regional cooperation is a task which is being handled on the local level and on the federal level, on the federal level there is still a consciousness that the regional cooperation is still a very important topics. And so the national government is very aware of the importance of the cross-border regions.
Beaucoup d'intérêt, messieurs, pour ce fameux traité d'Aix-la-Chapelle. Article 13.
There is a lot of interest in this Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty. Article 13 talks about skills, dedicated resources, and accelerated resources for Euro districts. How can this be spoken of in concrete terms? Give us examples. For you. I would say we're still developing because the Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty has been applied since 2020. One example, we have clarified following an amendment made by French parliamentarians. We have now in French law the possibility for Euro districts to have transport powers. So just in terms of transport, we have another example which we are working on at the moment with the local authorities directorate, and this modification is being done at the moment. We have to have a historical vision of matters. The Élysée Treaty 73 was the first general bilateral treaty between France and Germany after the war. So just 20 years after the war. The second bilateral treaty between France and Germany was the Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty. So 60 years later, this treaty, it was difficult to give birth to this treaty. No, I don't agree. It took a long time. It's for 30, 40 years. And no, I think that we reached this treaty very quickly. The Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty, we started working on it, I would say, in the middle of 2018, start of 2019. It was signed. It's exceptional for a treaty of this side. So still talking about this same treaty, Aix-la-Chapelle, have you? Oh, yes. Have you a concrete example of the resolution of solving obstacles by the Franco-German committee under the Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty? So over to you. Do you have an example? Our audience are asking for concrete example.
Well, just to give you some concrete examples, and we've already mentioned it at the beginning of our discussion, and that's on the functioning of the committee when we had the border controls during the COVID pandemic. And the committee acted as had a catalyzing power on this issue, and there were discussions between the capitals and also between the regions. These discussions have been intensified. This was, so to say, this acted as a valve to ease the pressure which existed during the crisis, and also to take into account the very, very concrete problems which the populations on both sides of the borders had to deal with, for example, health concerns.
So we've spoken about the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the economic crisis. So in this context, do you think that states are fully promoting cooperation, promoting cross-border matters? So we've spoken about people who didn't want to sign. So what would people there have to say about their sovereignty from a certain point of view behind their borders, mental borders and real borders? We saw that at the start of the health crisis. I hope that we have learnt the lesson. So when we are struck in the same way, even if we do things differently, by a phenomenon which we can't control, we are much more efficient if we cooperate, uh, if we cooperate rather than shutting ourselves within our borders. So we saw this in the recovery plan. Yes, the COVID crisis. First of all, there was a reaction between France, Italy, Belgium, and I can see the reaction was completely irrational, inefficient between France and Germany. At the start of the COVID crisis, we even refused to send medical equipment to Italy. That was the first 2 weeks, and we then understood that the virus didn't have a nationality, and just by cooperating would we be able to better manage the health crisis and care for each of us, but also we were moving out of the established contacts, and we could have had a financial instrument to counter the crisis, and that is why we are now talking about European aid with loans and so on, 50 billion plan, which had no precedent in the history of the European Union, which we then developed in a period of 2 to 3 months. I think that Europe demonstrated its ability to react and to be creative, which looks good for the future. But now you showed the impact of the economic and energy consequences of the war here in Ukraine, not just in cross-border areas, external cross-border areas, but other regions too. Today we must demonstrate the same creativity. We need to demonstrate our solidarity in terms of economy, in terms of energy, following the Ukraine crisis, and we need to have specific action for the regions the most struck by this, which is external border regions. So that is what we are suggesting, a work which we are doing at the moment at the European Parliament, and we need to push the states in that direction. I don't have a definitive answer, but I think that we can and we must move in that direction. So, Slido question from Joshua Frey for you. How have governments changed their communication lines so that the border regions can be informed earlier of border closures, if that was the case? So, and then we'll also take questions from the audience here. Get your questions ready. So the way we close borders, if we could see there was an improvement, for example, during the pandemic, start of 2020, everybody was a bit surprised, but one member state took the lead and was then followed by others. At the start of 2021, the question came up again about restoring borders controls, and there was a discussion. In fact, there was a permanent dialogue between the prefects and elected representatives, and the elected representatives also were able to discuss with the government because we knew that there was time. So there was discussion about the need to see what needed to be done, and including for states which reintroduced border controls first. Remember that it was following the request of local representatives. It was the request of a local authority that the Ministry of the Interior in that country decided to put border controls in place. So discussions had always taken place despite what we are saying. So questions maybe from the audience to continue this discussion a little longer. I can see there are microphones in the room, circulating in the room. Please don't hesitate to ask your question. Raise your hand. There is a lady over there. And then maybe over here too. Hello, thank you very much. I'm Stefania Petrosilo. I work for the Europark Federation, which is the Federation for Protected Natural Spaces in Europe. So my question is clearly about the environment and the protection of nature and the protection of the landscape. So I would like to know a bit more about the place that you see for this specific subject, noting that, of course, when we're speaking about protecting nature, the protection of the landscape, we are speaking clearly too about implementing the Green Deal on the field, but we're also talking about disaster prevention, not just by cooperating after a disaster, but also about prevention. So protecting nature, it's all of that. It's protecting rivers, the impact of climate, and so on. Noting too that COVID demonstrated that the general public has a great need for natural spaces which are often on borders. You're absolutely right. Absolutely. I would like to add that I am responsible for a program, Europark program, called the Cross-Border Parks Program, which is a program to support parks on borders and who work together, because often we are faced with all of the problems that we have mentioned today and yesterday too. And parks don't just work on protecting nature, but also everything related to this. Tourism, for example, culture, dialogue between local communities. So thank you very much. So that's a very good question, because it is good to develop, first of all, perhaps Mr. Behmenburg and then Mr. Gozi, because the French-Italian border is very beautiful, very much protected too. It's good to develop this, but do we not also need to protect and preserve along borders and maybe environments as well, rather just economic and business development? So I'm speaking to a German, so I'm being delicate.
Well, this is a topic which is also relevant in Germany. We've been discussing it on the political level, because there is a definite need to support environmental protection. At the same time, it's very important not to leave any region behind, and to prevent that these regions become structurally poor regions. So we want to avoid that there is a conflict between economic goals and also our attempts to improve the quality of living and environmental aspects. And if such regions are at borders,
so we also want to look at this from a German.
well, yes, the protection of rivers, it's very important, also looking at the Rhine. And of course, we are very happy to have France as our neighbors. But also when I look east and look towards our border with Poland and Czech Republic, we've got some regions there which are not densely populated. And there we have a very good cross-border dialogue, just to resolve the conflicts which I've mentioned. In 2 weeks' time, we will have Mr. Raffarin in our ministry, and we will further discuss these topics.
Bon, alors on est sauvés. Alors,
So we're saved. So I was saying, Sandro Gozi, why? Okay, the French-Italian border is a protected zone. Sometimes we have the impression that to solve economic concerns, you talk a lot about cross-border matters, you talk about problems companies have, and on the other hand, the question of protecting the environment is much more complex. And you have spoken about the tunnel project. But you know all about the challenges of these cross-border programs. Yes, first of all, I agree with what has just been said. And from an Italian point of view, these problems are very similar to German problems in terms of regional competencies with the same levels among the different regions. So to answer your question, and the question from the room. First of all, protecting biodiversity, the environment, and sustainable development is one of the goals of the Quirinal Treaty. I'm not going to go into details, but there's Article 7, Article 10 of the treaty, which answer your question in as much as the environment is a priority for cross-border cooperation at a regional and local level, as well as protection of natural parks on land and at sea. These are part of the goals in the framework of the environment in the context of Franco-Italian cooperation. So this is a high priority because the Quirinal Treaty has got set its priorities, and sustainable development, biodiversity, protection of biodiversity is a priority which is reflected in this treaty. This is what is of interest to us. We have not redefined what has been done elsewhere. What we did is to try and invent a new form of bilateral cooperation across the borders based on society's priorities, which we share. We can to speak about the tunnel. I don't know how many tons are moved between France and Italy, and these tonnage could be transported by trains. That would be a reduction in pollution, which would be enormous for the air, for the whole area, for the whole region. So from this point of view, it is absolutely not just compatible, but I would say it is a factor that we need to use to fight against pollution in a region which is basin with 7 and 8 million people on the French side live in this region. So we're talking about an impact. We're talking about an infrastructure which will have an impact on pollution, a positive impact, but will include part of France in one of the great axes across France. Yes, we've spoken about this yesterday in previous roundtables about the importance of including residents in cross-border projects, which can be considered in different ways, but the way citizens feel is very important too. What we try to do we try in these cross-border movements, do we try to include citizens enough? I would say that it's a citizen challenge. I have been very impressed by all the presentations we have had, particularly the last one. I think that what we are doing here, we are collectively wondering how to manage our interdependence. So cross-border matters are an interdependence. So there's a lot of consideration to be given to opposition, which is not complete, but the contrast, the tension which exists between interdependence and sovereignty, because often when we speak about sovereignty, you are more faced with interdependence that you need to manage whilst respecting the skills of each individual. At borders, what we see is strong interdependencies which are more delicate, which are more exposed compared to more discrete interdependencies when you are in capitals. I'm thinking about the map that we saw earlier, which showed that Ireland was impacted by the war in Ukraine. And here, clearly, there is an interdependence that we had not expected. I'd like to know more about this later. I think it must be economic. It's head offices because Russian companies. And interdependencies that we weren't expecting. So on borders, interdependencies can be seen clearly, and we understand them clearly. And if we want to manage them as well as cross, we need to start from citizens. So a Slido question states, can we envisage cross-border referendums on Euro districts to have a better involvement of populations in crucial questions such as a new rail link or energy questions too? Are local referenda a solution? In some member states, there are laws on local referenda, on consultations, which are often indicative, so written up in different ways in the different legal systems. So these instruments already exist. It's a good starting point. But I think that what is important is the local representatives remain committed, as we have seen at a lot of borders. And currently there is a real mobilization on the French-Italian border, which I've also seen on the German-French border, with local representatives who remain committed. Priorities are known. They need to support them. They need to communicate about them. They need to speak about them with civil society as well. Thank you very much to all three of you for having taken part in this very high-level debate. Thank you to all of them